Morning, everybody. I'm Katy Adams. I'm the Director of Addiction Services for Southwestern Behavioral Health Care. So some of you may have heard of Stepping Stone. That's our residential addiction facility here in Evansville. So I'm the director of that, and we have a new program called Stepping Forward for Women, which is a transitional residential program for pregnant women with primary addiction issues. And so that's a brand new program this year. It's the only thing like it that we have in our community and really in our state. And so I'm excited to talk a little bit about that today. But I was sort of feeling like a redheaded stepchild until Charlie started talking, and he really had a good lead-in for me, so I appreciate that. I'm going to talk about trauma. And so probably everybody's wondering, well, what does that have to do with anything? Well, it has everything to do with everything, right? So trauma is the thread through all of these things. Trauma is the thread through all of these things. And so I want to talk about some data about that, but also some precautions that we can make as individuals and as a community and what we can do to help build resilience. So if you have not heard of the ACE study, this is something that you should Google. So Google ACE study. ACE stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. And if you Google it, you're going to find all kinds of things to read about. So the ACE study was done about 20 years ago in California. It's a very large study, a longitudinal study, where they asked people a series of 10 questions that had to do with their childhood experiences, things that happened to them under the age of 18. And depending on how they answered those 10 questions, they would have a score between 0 and 10. 10 means more trauma, 0 means no trauma, right? And so they followed these people over a course of time to determine what their long-term health outcomes are, to see if there seems to be a significance there. So what they found is 2/3 of the participants had at least one ACE. Okay, so I think there was like 150 people registered today, so 100 of us have at least one ACE, or adverse childhood experience. 1 in 5 had 3 or more ACEs, so about 30 of us. And what they found was that the relationship between the dose, or how many of these ACEs somebody had increased the intensity of their long-term negative health outcomes and their well-being. So the higher the score, the more issues this person had. Now I'll tell you that in addictions treatment, everybody that walks through our door has trauma, everybody. And so we've sort of developed a language with these ACE scores where I'm able to say to a therapist, this person has a score of 8, and they know what that means, right? We know how we need to approach somebody. So what does this have to do with what we're talking about today? Well, this is what the study found, is that our health, which has to do with obesity, diabetes, depression, suicide attempts, STDs, go on further, as well as our behaviors, which could include tobacco use, drug and alcohol use, other risky type behaviors, as well as our life potential, meaning our graduation rates, our employment rates, our success as individuals, is significantly tied to our ACE score. So as you can see from this graph, somebody who has no ACEs or one ACE, their outcomes are going to be pretty good, right? But once you hit 4, 5, 6, the long-term impact on somebody's life, on their health with chronic health conditions, as well as their life potential, their well-being, is significantly impacted. So this is a topic that we haven't talked about. Charlie touched on it a bit, is trauma. How does trauma link to these issues, these public health concerns? So why are we paying attention to trauma that happens before the age of 18? Well, we talked about a little bit earlier that the child's brain isn't developed, right? About age 26 or so, they say that the brain has fully developed. So in this picture you'll see the 5-year-old, it's very colorful, right? Well, the blue, the kind of predominantly blue purplish area, that is the fully developed part of the brain. So as somebody grows, you'll see there's more and more and more blue. And once you're 26 or so, your brain's fully developed. So can you imagine being 5'10" and your brain looks like that and you're exposed to trauma? How in the world is your brain going to be able to process that? And if you're 5, 10 years old, you don't have coping skills, right? You don't know how to deal with those things. And so what kind of chronic impact does that have on somebody when you're a child being exposed to an adverse childhood experience? Now adults, we deal with trauma, right? We live in a broken world. We all have trauma. We all have bad things happen, right? But when you're an adult and your ACE is low, well, your brain's developed now, right? You have coping skills. You have resilience. You have support around you. You can weather that storm. But if your ACE is high, you don't have those skills. So did you know there's a stronger link between trauma and addiction than there is between obesity and diabetes? 2/3 of addicts report being abused as children. That means that the war on drugs is a war on traumatized people that just need help. So what would our world look like if we talked about, oh, diabetes and obesity? Yeah, we all get that. I think those two words fit great together. Smoking and cancer, we all agree with that, right? But what if we started thinking addiction and trauma? Have you ever thought about those two together? That's not out there, is it? Do we think about obesity and trauma? Do we think about tobacco use and trauma? Do we think about these things? We don't. But I'm telling you, trauma is the thread through all of these chronic issues. So this is interesting. So this pyramid shows at the bottom the adverse childhood experiences that we talked about. And above that is the disrupted neurodevelopment. So we talked about that. And then comes the social, emotional, and cognitive impairment as a consequence of that neurodevelopment being disruptive, as well as that exposure to traumatic events. And then we have the adoption of high risk or health risky behaviors. So you're 8, 10 years old and you're exposed to these things. How do you cope? How does the 8-year-old or 10-year-old cope? Well, gosh, they smoke cigarettes, right? They steal some booze out of dad's cabinet. They go steal things. They go not act right, right? That's what they do, because that's how they cope. So that's that high-risk behavior that starts at an early age. And in working in addiction services, I will tell you that the most common age of onset of smoking or any drug or alcohol use is 8. It's 8. So this high school drug education thing, man, you're way too late. Way too late. We need to be doing this in 3rd grade. But the other thing that's fascinating about this that I've been learning about recently, and I don't understand that well, so I don't want to talk about it too much, is epigenetics and trauma. What researchers have found is that when somebody is exposed to a traumatic event, there is a marker that lands on your DNA and mutates it. And that mutation on your DNA means that your DNA is now not expressing itself in the way, not working in the way that it was intended. And people with that have consequences of increased chance of mental illness, substance abuse problems, chronic health problems, all of these things, okay? So that's interesting, right? What's even more interesting is that that is intergenerational. And what I mean by that is that my trauma is being passed on to my children. So my children may have no ACEs, but my genetic mutation has been passed on to them. They did a study on Holocaust survivors. PBS has a really interesting documentary on YouTube, so you can just do Holocaust, PBS, genetic trauma, that kind of thing. You can see it. It's about 7 or 8 minutes long. So what they did was they had a couple, both were Holocaust survivors, and they got married. They took their blood, they found the mutations in their genetic, in their DNA, and then they tested their children who were born and raised in America, had no ACE. The children had the same genetic markers in their DNA as their parents, but they were never exposed to that trauma. So we have to think about this. We have to think about how this is being passed on and passed on and passed on, and what we can do to help build resilience and strengthen people and prevent re-traumatization. So what does trauma look like? So let's think about this for a minute. You know, in addiction services, like I mentioned, pretty much everybody walks through the door with some trauma. And I'll be honest, working in community mental health for 20 years, sometimes we deal with folks that aren't acting very pleasant. So if you ever had that experience in our community, everybody has, right? You're at the store, you're at the gas station, and you're saying that person ain't right, right? Okay? So you know what that is? That's trauma. So how do we treat those people? How do we think about those people? What does trauma look like? Well, you know, outside the ACE, you got to think about, even though you get through childhood with no ACEs, there are traumatic things that happen to adults, right? And we got to think about things outside of just abuse. I mean, when we think about trauma as a child, we think about abuse and those kinds of things. But there's also things like food insecurity. Charlie talked about this a little bit. Poverty. You know how traumatic it is to go to bed hungry each night and not know when you're going to eat? We can't minimize that. Toxic living environments, lack of access to the things that you need, being a child of the opiate crisis. Another thing Charlie brought up that I appreciated is that we're not talking about families here. We're talking about overdose deaths, and we're talking about heroin rates and IV drug users. We're talking about addiction, and I understand that that's important, but we're not talking about the children and the families being left behind. That's trauma that they're enduring. What are their outcomes? So I think this kid's really cute. So, you know, when you think about kids that are being exposed to trauma, you know, this is what they look like, right? They're cute kids. But this kid, physically, he's 8. But developmentally, he's only 3. And why is that? Neglect, maltreatment. And experientially, he's more like 25. He has no clue how to react to all of that has happened to him in his short life. These are the people that are in our community that are having these outcomes that we're talking about today, these children. So you see a mom struggling with her kid, or you see somebody struggling with their kid in a grocery store, you're quick to judge, right? She can't handle her child. Well, let me tell you, there may be something going on there. There may be trauma. And perhaps what you could say is you are doing an amazing job. If you need help, let me know. I'm here for you. Maybe that's what you could say, rather than kind of giving them the stink eye, right? Maybe that's what you could do. So this is what trauma looks like. Okay, so none of these people look very pleasant, right? And I just threw some pictures up there. There's some famous people up there, but you know, this is what people look like. And none of them look like people you want to go to have coffee with, right? But we need to be, because who do they have? What are their outcomes? These are the folks with ACE scores. And this is what their life has become. So this is a public health problem that no one is talking about. Trauma. This is a public health problem. The outcomes you're talking about here are all the symptoms of this problem, the consequences of this problem. So this picture, you may recognize, this is I think a year or 2 old. They took this picture in Ohio, a police officer did. So this is a grandma and her boyfriend that are passed out from using a whole bunch of heroin. The little pumpkin in the back seat in his jammies is the grandson. I blurred out his face. It's pretty traumatizing just to look at it, isn't it? So who's taking care of that little pumpkin back there? Have we talked about him? What's his outcome going to be? How many ACEs does he have so far in his 4 or 5 years of life? This is a public health problem nobody's talking about. So are we making things worse, right? So like I said, we live in a broken world. We can't keep traumatic things from happening. That's just fact, right? We can try to build a strong community that strengthens families to keep these things from happening, but we live in a broken world, right? So what we can do is we can try to prevent re-traumatizing people, right? They've already been through it, let's not make them go through it again. And we can build resilience in our communities. So the first was preventing re-traumatization. So what if everybody thought about trauma-informed care as a universal precaution? So hospitals are familiar with this, right? If it's wet and it's not yours, don't touch it, right? Right? We all get that, right? We don't want diseases, we don't things that don't want our, I mean, we all get that, we're all trained with that. We all wear gloves, we all do those things, we all wash our hands. We understand that. So why can't we do this too? Why can't we, as business leaders, as healthcare providers, use trauma-informed care. And what I mean by that is treat everybody in front of you as if their ACE score is a 10. Just assume it. How would you treat them different if you just assumed that about them? So what would Evansville be like if every bank, every grocery store, every gas station, every school, every hospital, every clinic, everywhere you went, people got this? That they created a place of safety and mutual respect for everybody that walks in the door, even if they look like those not so pleasant people. I always tell people that if somebody's acting nasty towards you, it's because something really nasty happened to them, right? So what if, as leaders in your sphere of influence, what if you made your place of work a trauma-informed place that would prevent re-traumatizing people who have already been through a lot? Are you doing that? Are you doing that in your kind of area of influence? And as an individual, are you doing that? Do you have that neighbor that you just kind of don't like, or is kind of weird and you're just trying to stay away from? You know, places that you go, places you hang out. Are you doing that personally? How do you treat people? So building resilience is the other part of this. So how do we build a resilient community? How can we make Evansville more resilient so that the folks that live in it, even if they are exposed to trauma, they have the safety net? They at least have this ability to be resilient to these traumatic stressors. So at the bottom, I mean, this is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Everybody's probably seen this and knows about it, right? But oh my gosh, this is so basic and we're missing the boat. So basic needs. Everybody needs a safe place to live. How in the world are you going to get me to stop smoking if I don't have a safe place to live? Right? If I don't know where I'm going to eat next, how are you going to get me to stop doing whatever, stealing, right? So basic needs. We need to be able to have food and shelter. We need to feel safe. You know, if I'm going home to my abuser every night, I'm not going to stop smoking. I'm not going to stop shooting up. I'm not going to stop. It's low on my list right now. I'm just trying to survive. So we need to create safe places for people to live and go and feel unconditionally loved. And then social needs is just developing a recovery community, developing a community that focuses on being healthy, you know, the Healthier Evansville thing, giving opportunities for people to belong in a healthy environment. So those are things that we need to build as a community. We need more of these opportunities for people. So, like, we need mentors. Who are our kids hanging out with after school? What are young folks doing on Friday and Saturday nights? Are there like fun, safe, sober, recovery-oriented type of fun things to do? If not, we need more of those, right? What kind of recreational activities do we have? After-school programs. What are kids doing after school? Who are they with? We need to stop this quick fix, get a pill to fix mentality. There's no silver bullet for this trauma thing. There's no pill for trauma. There's no medication that treats it. So we need to talk big picture here. We need to talk about building resilience in individuals. We need to stop the intergenerational cycle, and we need to be kind to people. We need to walk a mile in their shoes and just be kind, even though people are nasty. Even though people aren't ready to stop smoking or aren't ready to stop whatever, one day they will be. Just be kind. Build a relationship. And then lastly, just as individuals, we need to build resilience. Everybody needs meaningful relationships. Everybody needs a sense of purpose and meaning. We need a personal mission. We need to have the sense of charitable giving and volunteerism. And so folks that kind of come out of this traumatic background, if you can help support these things to build within them, you're building resilience for them. And that's what we want. So developing these types of things for our community, but also supporting individuals that you may know. And so I just want to say thank you for listening to me, because I know this isn't exactly what seemed to be what would be talked about today. But as you know, or as you now know, this is the common thread. This is what we're dealing with. And so I want to introduce somebody very special to you guys. I mentioned earlier our Stepping Forward program is for pregnant women. And then after they have their babies, they stay with us in this transitional kind of housing arrangement. and we just provide support and education and just love on them and give them the treatment that they need with their babies kind of through that difficult first up to 6 months after pregnancy. We've collaborated with the Women's Hospital, who's providing the OB care and has trained our staff, because we know nothing about babies and OB. We know about addiction. So it's been a really cool partnership. But I want to introduce you to Jessica and little Romeo. So Jessica is one of our folks, one of our participants, and little Romeo, who is adorable, by the way, and sleeping. Are you good?
Yeah.
So she's just going to share a little bit of her story. So if you'd just be really welcoming to her. There you go.
I'm Jessica, and this is Romeo, like she said. I'm a recovering heroin addict. I used until I was 7.5 months pregnant, and I was hopeless. I felt helpless, desperate, and I got arrested, and I learned about this wonderful program. I'm sorry, I didn't think I was going to cry. And Greg helped me through it. So blessed that he's healthy, and they help us so much at the house. We do our 12-step program, go to meetings every day, therapy. We have living in balance classes, smoking cessation. Struggled a lot with quitting smoking, but the smoking cessation classes, they help us a lot. I'm just so grateful to stepping forward. If it wasn't for them, I wouldn't have Romeo in my life. And I'd probably still be in jail, so. But I wish there were more programs like that open for other women struggling with addiction. That's all I got, I'm sorry.
Isn't she incredibly brave? Yes. Incredibly brave. I'm so proud of you. So the reason why we wanted her to talk is just so that you can kind of see this is all that we're talking about today, right? We need more places like this. We need more partnerships like this. And so thanks again. We do have a table if you want to talk more about referrals to our programs. But Chris Ryan is perfect to go next because she's with the Women's Hospital. And thanks for listening.